Picture a machine built to carry 12 armed men into machine gun fire, its steel hull built to shrug off shrapnel, its half-track wheels built to climb terrain no truck could touch. Now picture that same machine hauling hay bales across a frozen Montana pasture, or parked behind an oil derrick in West Texas dragging drilling pipe through mud no ordinary vehicle could cross. That happened. Not once. Not a handful of times. Thousands of times, and almost nobody kept count. Somewhere between 41,000 and 53,000 of these half-tracks rolled off American assembly lines during the war. White Motor Company built them. So did Autocar. So did Diamond T and International Harvester. 4 different companies racing to arm the same army with the same idea. A truck up front, a tank in back, a machine that could go where wheels failed and outrun anything that could only crawl on treads. By the time Germany surrendered, there were more of these vehicles sitting in American inventory than the country would ever need again. And that is where this story actually begins. Not on a battlefield. In a warehouse ledger nobody wanted to finish writing. You are about to learn what happened to thousands of half-tracks that the United States government built to fight a war and then simply could not find a use for. Some ended up on ranches, some ended up arming forces the United States never officially sold weapons to at all, and the paper trail connecting those 2 facts is stranger than any rumor floating around today. To understand why this happened, you have to understand what these vehicles actually were built to do. The M2 and M3 half-tracks were the workhorses nobody remembers next to the Sherman tank. They didn't win headlines, they won logistics. A half-track could tow an anti-tank gun through mud that stopped a jeep cold. It could carry a mortar crew across broken ground under fire and let them fire back without dismounting. It could serve as an ambulance 1 week and a mobile anti-aircraft platform the next. The vehicle was never glamorous, it was essential. By 1944, the half-track had become one of the most produced vehicles in the entire American military. Documentary pacing note for you, the reader. The script continues in unbroken narration from here, matching your channel's established plain text delivery format. Production ramped hard because the Army needed flexibility more than it needed firepower. Half-tracks served in North Africa hauling supplies through desert sand no wheeled truck could handle. They served in Italy climbing mountain roads engineers hadn't finished building. They landed at Normandy in the 2nd and 3rd waves, carrying reconnaissance troops inland before the beachhead was even secure. Every theater of the war ran on these machines, even when the history books forgot to mention them. And every factory building them ran around the clock, because nobody in 1943 believed the war would end anytime soon. Then it did. And nobody in Washington had planned for how fast. Germany surrendered in May of 1945. Japan surrendered that August, and almost overnight an economy built entirely around total war had no war left to fight. Factories that had been running 3 shifts a day started shutting down lines within weeks. Millions of soldiers who had been trained to fight were suddenly being shipped home by the boatload with nothing to do and no enemy left to face. And sitting in depots across the country and scattered across every liberated territory in Europe and the Pacific sat an ocean of military hardware nobody had a plan for. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, aircraft, artillery pieces by the tens of thousands. The United States had built the most powerful war machine in human history, and now it had absolutely nowhere to put it. The government's answer was an agency almost nobody has heard of today called the War Assets Administration. Their job was staggering in scope. Take everything the military no longer needed and get rid of it. Sell it. Scrap it. Give it away. Anything to stop paying for storage on equipment that had already served its purpose. Warehouses from California to Georgia filled past capacity. Airfields turned into open-air parking lots for vehicles nobody wanted to store under a roof. And half-tracks, thousands of them, sat baking in the sun waiting for someone somewhere to decide what they were worth. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. The paperwork could not keep up. Disposal agents were processing so much surplus so fast that inventory numbers from one report to the next simply didn't match. Vehicles got sold in bulk lots to scrap dealers who then resold pieces to buyers the government never tracked. Some records survive in painstaking detail. Others simply vanish into gaps nobody has ever fully closed. To this day, historians cannot agree on exactly how many half-tracks left military hands in the years after the war. And that gap in the record is exactly how a machine built to carry infantry into battle ended up doing chores on a cattle ranch 3,000 miles from the nearest fighting. So what were the choices facing the men in charge of getting rid of all this steel? Scrap it for raw metal and recoup a fraction of its value overnight. Sell it whole to civilian buyers who might actually use it as designed. Or ship it overseas to allies rebuilding shattered militaries who desperately needed anything with an engine and armor. Every option had defenders inside the War Assets Administration, and every option had critics. Scrapping was fast and clean, but it threw away machines that still had years of working life left in them. Selling domestically brought in cash, but risked putting military hardware into the hands of buyers with no oversight at all. Shipping it abroad solved the storage problem, but raised uncomfortable questions about which governments, and which fighting forces within those governments, were actually receiving American war material. Congress debated, foreign policy officials debated, and in the meantime, the machines kept sitting there depreciating by the day. Every week of indecision cost the government real money it desperately wanted to stop spending. So compromises got made. Different vehicles went different directions depending on condition, location, and frankly how much anyone in charge that particular month wanted to deal with the paperwork of doing it properly. Domestically, demilitarization became the standard fix. Strip the mounted machine guns, remove radio equipment considered sensitive, leave the engine, the drivetrain, and the half-track's legendary ability to go anywhere, then auction it off for a fraction of its original cost. Half-tracks that had cost the government thousands of dollars to build sold at surplus auctions for a few hundred. And the buyers were exactly who you'd expect once you strip away the myth of some coordinated militia buying spree. Ranchers in rugged terrain who needed something that could cross ground no farm tractor could handle. Oil companies in Texas and Oklahoma who needed to drag drilling equipment through mud fields no truck could survive. Construction outfits building roads through mountain country where nothing else could get traction. These weren't fringe buyers stockpiling weapons. They were working men buying the toughest second-hand vehicle on the market because it happened to be cheap and available. But not every half-track disposed of after the war stayed on American soil doing farm work. And this is where the story turns into something far stranger than most people realize. Overseas, the calculus was completely different. As the world reorganized after 1945, new nations were being born and old empires were collapsing almost simultaneously. Armies that barely existed a year earlier suddenly needed equipment fast and had almost no manufacturing capacity of their own to build it. Surplus American half-tracks, reliable, proven, and cheap compared to buying new, became one of the most sought-after pieces of hardware on a black and grey arms market that boomed in the chaos of the late 1940s. Israel's founding in 1948 is the case historians point to most often. The nascent Jewish state faced war on its first day of existence with almost no formal military industry of its own. What it had instead was a scattered network of arms buyers working through intermediaries in Europe and elsewhere sourcing whatever mobile firepower they could find on the post-war surplus market. Half-tracks acquired through these channels became core equipment for forces that would soon become the Israel Defense Forces. Some of that hardware traced directly back to American surplus stock that had officially been sold or scrapped and then quietly changed hands multiple times before it ever reached a battlefield. A machine built in an Ohio factory to fight Germans ended up defending a country that didn't exist yet when the vehicle rolled off the assembly line. Israel wasn't alone. Half-tracks turned up in the hands of nationalist forces in China during the final years of their civil war. They turned up supporting French colonial forces fighting in Indochina before that conflict grew into something far larger. They turned up in Latin America equipping national armies, rebuilding themselves after years of wartime neglect. And in more than a few cases, they turned up in the hands of irregular forces and paramilitary groups that no official government transfer document would ever admit selling weapons to. The line between a legitimate national army and an armed militia gets blurry fast in the chaos of a country being born. And American surplus half-tracks ended up on both sides of that blurry line, more often than any official record wants to fully acknowledge. So was it really 10,000 half-tracks split between ranchers and militias exactly as the headline claims? The honest answer is that nobody kept a clean enough ledger to prove that number either way. What the surviving records do show is something more interesting than a tidy statistic. A single production run of American war machines scattering in every direction at once. Some became farm equipment, some became construction tools, some became the backbone of a brand new nation's first army, and some vanished into conflicts so poorly documented that historians are still finding half-tracks in old photographs from wars nobody expected them to be part of. Here are the details most people never hear about this disposal chaos. Some half-tracks sold as surplus were bought sight unseen in massive lots by dealers who had no idea what they were even reselling until crates got opened months later. Others sat so long in storage that by the time buyers arrived, the tires had rotted through and had to be replaced before the vehicle could even move under its own power. A number of half-tracks sold to oil companies in the Southwest were stripped down and modified with custom rigging never intended by military engineers, turning battlefield vehicles into some of the earliest heavy equipment used in America's post-war oil boom. In at least a few documented cases, surplus half-tracks that had been sold for civilian scrap were discovered decades later still armored and mechanically intact, having survived as farm equipment for so long that their owners had no idea what they were actually driving. And perhaps strangest of all, several half-tracks that fought in the earliest battles of Israel's War of Independence can still be traced today to specific American production batches from factories that had no idea their vehicles would end up defending a country that didn't exist when the machines were built. None of that fits neatly into a single headline number, but all of it is true. The legacy of this disposal chaos still echoes today in ways most people never connect back to a warehouse ledger from 1946. The half-track's design influenced decades of post-war armored personnel carrier development, its combination of mobility and protection becoming the template for vehicles still in service around the world. Surviving examples now sit in museums from Fort Benning to collections in Israel that treat them as founding artifacts of a nation's military history. Private collectors still restore working half-tracks today, hunting down parts from a supply chain that scattered across 3 continents 80 years ago. And the story of exactly how many left military hands and where they all went remains one of the messier chapters in the history of American military disposal, a reminder that winning a war and figuring out what to do with everything you built to win it are 2 very different problems. So the next time you hear a number thrown around about how many surplus half-tracks armed ranchers or militias after the war, remember this. The real story isn't a clean number. It's a warehouse full of paperwork that couldn't keep up with history moving faster than anyone in charge could write it down. And somewhere in that chaos, a single vehicle built in Ohio could end up hauling cattle feed across a Montana winter, or rolling into a desert battlefield defending a country still fighting to exist. Both stories are true. Both happened, and the government that built these machines never fully tracked which fate found which half-track. If you enjoyed uncovering this piece of forgotten history, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because next time we're heading into a hangar where the United States tore apart a captured enemy jet piece by piece just to steal its secrets, and what they found inside changed the direction of the entire jet age.